Well, what I thought was an exhaust leak is actually a blown head gasket. And so we're going to have to pull the cylinder heads off and put new gasket in there and see what's going on and what caused that problem.
Seriously, I just had it.
The first thing you're going to want to do is to disconnect the battery and make sure that it is disconnected so that you're not messing up your electronics. We already have the rear cover off, and so we're going to start by disconnecting the air filter housing and pulling it off. It's a 10mm here for the hose clamp or a Phillips head screwdriver. And then there are a couple of 13mm nuts on the top that hold this guy on, and then we can pull that off and set it aside. Now we can remove the muffler. There are 4 12mm bolts that hold it up on the underside of the motor. Now that we have the muffler off, we're going to remove the oil cooler and set it aside. There are 2 10mm bolts on either side that hold this bracket on. And once we remove those, we should be able to get this and just push it off to the side. That'll allow us to get this cover off a little bit easier. Not 100% sure if this guy needs to come off, but I'm going to take these 4 10mm bolts off on here. I'm pretty sure that these studs go down through the cover and will hold it on top of the motor. So pretty sure that's the case, but I'm not 100%. We'll find out in a short while. The next thing I'm going to go after is the fuel pump assembly. You'll need a pair of angled needle nose pliers in order to get this little keeper off of there, and then it has 2 12mm bolts that we should be able to sneak in there and undo, and then we'll be able to lift this guy off and move it aside. When you pull off this top fuel line, it will leak fuel, and this is gravity fed up to the fuel pump, so you'll want to kink off this line. You can do that with a pair of vice grips, and just have a little catch pan underneath just to catch any excess fuel that might drip out so it doesn't end up all over the place. Next, we're going to remove this cover that has 2 Phillips head screws here and 3 12mm bolts that you'll need to remove. We're almost ready to pull the cover off. There's a 10mm bolt here, one that holds the oil fill tube, and then there's a 12mm here that you'll need to take out using a wrench. Turns out this 12mm bolt won't come out because this is in the way, so you need an 8mm to pull these screws out, and you also need a pair of needle nose pliers or pliers to pull this tube off of the breather for the valve cover. There we go, we should be loose, which we are. Chances are your tractor's pretty dirty, so I'm actually going to throw this back on there and throw a piece of tape over here, and I'm also going to do the same thing on the other side with this little breather tube here. Just throw a piece of tape over it so that I can clean up all this stuff in through here and not get it into the inside of the engine. Now we're ready to remove the throttle and the choke cables. So I'm going to take a little bit of valve marker paint, and I'm just going to mark where this guy was so that I know exactly where to put it back. Now we can take and cut off these zip ties so that we can pull the spark plug wires out and then remove the intake manifold. In order to remove the intake manifold, you're going to have 4 10mm on the top side, and it looks to be maybe a 10 or 12 on either side for the support bracket, and then this whole assembly should be able to lift off. Before doing all that, I'm obviously going to clean all this stuff up in through here just so that I'm not dropping stuff into the cylinder head. Just so we're on the same page, I did buy this mower used, and it looks as though this has needed cleaned out for a really long time. A lot of this debris in here is probably blocking a lot of cooling airflow, which is probably the reason I blew a head gasket in the first place. So keep it clean, people. This intake manifold is a little bit more complicated than I thought it was going to be. There is a clip here that prevents over rev, and it's a linkage that goes down to a mechanical linkage on the underside. You'll need to remove this spring and then this retaining clip in order to pull this lever out and make sure that nothing is connected to your intake manifold prior to taking it off. Now that we have that linkage disconnected, I've already removed the 2 10mm bolts on the underside, so I'm going to remove these 4, and hopefully this intake will just come right off. Of course, you always forget something. The choke lever right here is still connected, so in order to remove that, we have to take out this bolt so that we can disconnect the linkage. So I just found one last sneaky 10mm bolt right in here that we'll need to remove in order to pull the assembly off. So as you can see, I have the intake off, but there's a sensor here that goes to a ground. We need to remove that ground and then disconnect this black wire in order to pull it the rest of the way off. I'm going to take this air cover off. It looks like you need to remove this wire out of the center portion of this little plastic clip, and then it looks like we have 3 10mm bolts left. Now that we have the cover gone, there is a 12mm bolt on either side of this. I think one might be a 12 and one might be a 10. And there's also a spring on the back side that connects to the over-rev linkage that it's kind of difficult to see. It's probably easiest to take it off from the bottom side, but you want to disconnect that so that you can remove this bracket and assembly here. And one spring gone. Cool. Scratch that. There are 2 12mm bolts on the left side, and 2 on the right. Oh, and here we have yet another spring right in through here. Can stay right where it is. So this spring linkage right here is just kind of getting in my way, and it will be, so I'm going to disconnect this and just get it the heck out of my road. We're going to want to remove these air shields and covers on both sides. On this side, you'll need to disconnect this wire, and you'll also need to take out a 10mm here on the starter cover and one on the underside in order to pry this or pull it loose and move it off to the side. It was kind of tight in there. It might prove to be a little bit of a pain in the butt to get that back in, but I'm just going to move it off to the side for the time being and just get it out of the road and clean up all this nonsense that no one bothered to clean up. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. We want to disconnect the oil pressure sensor wire and get it out of the road, and then if I'm lucky, there will only be this one 10mm bolt on the underside that you'll need to take out in order to move this guard out of the way. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a 5/8 socket and remove both of the spark plugs on either side. This will be a little bit easier to do with the heads still on the motor. After I'm done pulling these guys out, I've got 2 10mm bolts on both of the valve covers on either side. I'm going to pull those off so I can gain access to the head bolts that are underneath. Again, it's a good idea to have a catch pan underneath things whenever you pull this guy off. There'll be a little bit of oil that comes out, and you won't want it spilling all over the place. And of course, the gasket fell to pieces. Good thing I have new ones on the way. Now that we have the valve covers off, we can take a look at our valve train, and we can inspect it and make sure that it's good to go. I did notice this one is very loose, which means that'll need adjusted whenever I reassemble things and putting the new heads on. The other ones aren't too bad. Next, we're going to take a 10mm and we're going to break these guys loose, and we're going to unscrew them. You'll want to keep in mind that when you take these guys out, they need to go back in exactly where they came out. So you want to keep very close track of how and where these guys go in. Here's a quick example of something simple that you can do. You can mark each individual, push rod and rocker arm. It's not an LS. You can't just mix and match these guys. You got to put them back in where you took them out from. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the head bolts. There are 4 of them. They are 12mm. And ooh, wow, the bottom 2 were pretty loose. I imagine that's probably why this thing blew out. And there you have it, folks. That is a blown head gasket. Bad news bears. Now I know the other head gasket was blown, but I'm still gonna do this one while I have it this far apart because I feel it would be kind of foolish not to. Again, another loose one. And there's our other head gasket. Appears to be in pretty good shape. Doesn't have any leaks. Clearly much better than the other one. The next step will be removing all of the gasket material and getting these surfaces really clean. I just used a 3M stripping disc for this, and you can hook it up to a drill and just go over the top of the areas, and that way just make sure they're good and clean. And then of course you'll want to remove any sort of debris that's inside the chamber and clean it out, spray it out. You also want to clean up any excess gasket material from the head, exhaust, intake, and the valve cover. And then you'll want to clean these up really well inside the fins, get any sort of debris out of there, because all that debris in there, it really affects cooling of the head, which is why the head gasket probably blew in the first place. So you just want to clean everything up really well. Use an air compressor if you have it, or some carb cleaner, and just get these really clean and make sure all the mating surfaces are really clean, free of oil and debris before you go to reassemble. Before installing the head, you want to make note of the head bolts. Your new ones, some may come with these washers, and certain models have washers for the number 1 and 3 bolts. Mine did not come with those, so I can actually just take these and disregard them. So I'm not going to need those to seal things off. Before you install the head, you want to lubricate the threads of your head bolts with a lubricant. You can either buy it from Briggs Stratton, or like me, you can cheap out and you could just use some 10W30 motor oil. That's the route I'm going to take. The other thing that you'll want to do, and something that I normally do, is I just spray the head gasket with a copper coating. It's a spray a gasket high temp sealant. You can get it at Advance or whatever. I'm going to use this stuff right here. Copper spray a gasket high temp sealant. Permatex makes it. And this will just ensure a good seal from all the mating surfaces, and it'll also help heat transfer. All right, we've got our gasket all sprayed up with copper. I'm going to start my bolts in just on the top side and slide my gasket over top of the bolts. And just get these guys started in to hold things together, and then I'll put in the bottom bolts and then we'll tighten them down. Now that we have these snugged up, we're going to torque them down. You'll need a torque wrench, and you'll need to set it to either 165 inch-pounds or 350 inch-pounds, depending on the style of motor that you have. Read the manual, folks. That's all I can tell you. The tightening sequence is going to be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we're just going to torque those down really quick. I always like to go over them a second time just to make sure that they're torqued down properly. And now our head's installed. Now we're going to install the head on the other side. Keep in mind that this is the exact same thing, but your torque sequence is actually going to be different. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the right side as you're looking at the motor. Now that we have both heads installed, we're going to put the push rods and the rocker arms back together. I'm going to start with the exhaust just so that you can kind of see what I'm doing here. This is where it's important that you mark where these come from. I showed you the cardboard trick. Putting them back in, it'll give you less play whenever we go to do the valve adjustments, which I'll show you in a little bit. Both of these guys get torqued to 100 inch-pounds. Not a lot of pressure. Another thing to take note of is you want to make sure that your push rods are actually seated correctly on the back side of the motor, otherwise you're going to have a lot of problems later. Now that we have the rockers installed, we want to find top dead center. So what I find it's easiest to do is to take a small clean screwdriver and go in through the spark plug hole and just rotate the top of the motor until it comes up and won't go down anymore. And then you wiggle these guys. If they're tight, that means that you're on a compression stroke. So you want to rotate it again till your screwdriver comes back out. And just as it starts to come back down, that's your top dead center. And in order to adjust the valves, you want to move it about 1/4 inch, thereabouts, and then your valves will be loose. That's how you can tell that you're at top dead center. These call for a 5/1000 clearance, so you can tell I've still got a little bit of wiggle room there, so that intake valve will need adjusted. But the bottom one's pretty good. The exhaust is pretty tight. So the only valve we need to adjust on this side is going to be the intake valve. In order to adjust the valve, first you need to break it loose. So you'll take a 13mm wrench and a 5mm Allen key, and you'll put them in there, and then you'll break the keeper nut loose. Now the keeper nut's loose, you just want to slowly turn in, and it's not going to take much to get this guy to where it needs to be. Maybe like a 1/4 turn or thereabouts. And then you want to take your feeler gauge and put it in there. One of the things you can do is just tighten it until it gets a little bit tight in through there, and then hold it there. Now that we've got our adjustment in there, we'll just take and holding your Allen key tight, you'll snug down your 13mm keeper bolt. And once you're done, just double check. Still needs a little bit of an adjustment, so we're going to do that again until it's right. But that's how you adjust the valves. We've got the valves adjusted up, and as you can see, I can take my feeler gauge and just put it in there, and it just gives the slightest amount of drag between both of these guys here. Now we're ready to reinstall the valve covers. They come with these little sealing gaskets. I ordered new ones. It'll take 4 of them. Pretty straightforward. You'll want to remove these old ones, clean these surfaces here and here. I also replaced these gaskets. They're likely to fall apart whenever you pull things apart, just from heat or whatever. But you want to clean up both of the surfaces here and here, and then here and here. Put your new gaskets on, and then reinstall. Now we have everything cleaned up. We're going to put back together, and we're going to take our bolts with our new washers and reinstall those. These get installed at 25 inch-pounds. It takes almost 0 to get these guys in and click. So again, not a lot of pressure on these. I mean, it takes almost nothing to get these guys back installed. But again, make sure everything's clean before you put it back together so that you're not having oil leaks. You will repeat the process for the other side. Again, these don't take a lot to go on there, but this valve cover assembly is a little bit different. It actually has a breather assembly on it that has a gasket. Mine was leaking the tiniest bit of oil, and this gasket is kind of old, so I'm going to replace it with a new one. And you'll just stretch the new gasket over top, like so. I guess it's an O-ring, not a gasket. And these guys are keyed, so they only fit in one way. Usually this opening is opposite of the other side. So you can set it down in there. Make sure that your O-ring seats the whole way around. And then you can put your cover right over top of it. I'm not exactly sure what ridiculously low inch-pound these are torqued to, but I'm gonna guess it's probably around the same as the valve cover. The next thing I'm going to want to do is put this air guard back on. Make sure I connect my oil pressure sensor wire. There's a 10mm bolt on the underside of the head down here. And I'm also going to reinstall my spark plugs and wires. You also want to make sure that your spark plug gaps are set to 30 thousandths before you put them back in. So I just noticed that my spark plug wire is extremely chewed up, judging from the acorns that I picked up along the interior of the motor, and I think this had something to do with chipmunks. So I'm gonna have to order a new ignition coil and get that replaced. For the time being and for testing purposes, I'm just gonna tape this up with some electrical tape and put things back together until I get the parts ordered in. The next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to put the throttle linkage back onto the bottom side of the heads. So I'm just gonna undo these 12mm bolts that I put back into the heads so that I knew exactly where they were. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the throttle linkage back to the and secure to the underside of the head using the 12mm bolts. There is a spring that I had to remove that I'm just going to reconnect, and keeping in mind that I'll need to push a little bit this way in order to get my bolts started into the bottom side of the head, because that spring will put a little bit of tension on things. Before I get too carried away, I want to make sure that I get my governor linkage and spring back in where they need to be. So I'm just going to take that and loop it back in through, and then take the spring and push it back in through the hole. And what I'll do is just tuck it behind a wire up top just to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. So we will want to lift this spring up and out of the road just to get it out of the way so that we can get our other side started in. After a couple of tries trying to get this spring back in, I found it easiest to disconnect it from the top side and get it into the bottom side first. And then using a pair of needle nose pliers, just pinch it and get it back into the linkage on the upper side. Now we've got our throttle linkage and all that springs and nonsense back in there. We can take our other air cover and put it back in. For now, you'll want to just do the bottom right here and the upper left here. Those are the only two that you'll need to put in at this time. Now that we have our throttle linkage assembly back in and this spring, we're going to put this air cover back in. It'll take the bottom two and the upper left for now. While we're here, we're going to tuck our wires back into where they need to be in this little guard. We're just about ready to put our carburetor assembly and intake back on. You want to keep in mind that this linkage here needs to go down to here, and that our over rev linkage here needs to hook in to this clip right here. So it'll just push in, clip in, and then the spring goes over top. Another thing to remember is you'll want to get this ground wire, which will go to this upper left bolt right here, and then this sensor wire will actually feed through and reconnect back over here. And of course, you'll want to either have your other gaskets in really good shape, or if you're like me, you had to get new ones. I'm in the middle of installing the upper intake, and as you can see, I just hand started these guys through the new gaskets to give me a little bit of wiggle room, because there are a few other bolts that need to be connected. These for here, and then there are two brackets on the bottom side with 10 millimeters, but there's also the choke assembly, which will need to go on this side as well, which goes over top of the lower bracket. So before you go tightening everything down, you want to make sure that you've got your choke bracket back in place, the linkage for the choke reconnected into your linkage. This spring for your over rev needs to be put back together, and that should be it. Quick tip, you might need to loosen this 10 millimeter on this air guard in order to get the hole in the back side of the head, the air guard, the bracket that holds the carburetor assembly, and then the choke lever assembly all need to line up perfectly. So you might need to loosen this guy so that you can wiggle this guard around in order to get things to go where you want them to. Next, we're going to put our throttle and our choke cables back together. They just stick in like this and then go through the loops, and then you tighten down the loops. And you can use the marks that we used with our valve paint marker earlier. You can barely see them on the bottom one, you can barely see them on the top, but we're just going to line those back up to where they were and then tighten these guys down, and we'll be done with that portion of the project. Now, if you remember, there were some wires that came through that were zip tied to the intake manifold on the top side. I'm actually just going to re-zip tie those on the bottom side loosely, just to keep them away from the ignition coils and the flywheel and any moving parts and stuff that's going to get hot, and just secure those cables on the underside there. Now we're going to reinstall the top cover, keeping in mind that we've got a couple of bolts over here. We're going to need to remove the top of this breather assembly in order to get that 12 millimeter bolt in there, and we've got a couple down in the bottom side here, and then of course this bolt and this bolt will all need to get pulled out, and then we can put a button on things there. Now that we've got the top cover and the bolts snugged down, we can put this this cover back on. This didn't need to come off. It just looked like it may have needed to, so we're just gonna put that on. And after that, I'm gonna put our Vanguard cover back over top here and get these 2 screws and a couple of 12mm bolts and put a button on those 2 things, and we'll almost be done. Now we're ready to reinstall the fuel pump assembly. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start in this bolt right here first so that I can angle this guy up and get this hose over top of the bottom here. And then I can line up my other bolt here, get that tightened up, and then I can tighten those 2 down, rehook the fuel lines, and get the hose clamps back over top. Now all we need to do is reconnect the muffler on the bottom side and the air filter assembly and cleaner here and here. So we'll have a couple more bolts, and then we should be able to try and fire this guy up and see what we've got. The last thing we'll need to do is put the back cover on and tighten that up with a 13mm. But before I do, I'm just gonna double check all my little connections and you know, the ones that I can see, and just make sure that everything's tight, all the wires that I disconnected or reconnected, all that fun happy stuff. And then we'll throw the guard on, and we're gonna crank her over after we get the battery reconnected and see what she's got. All right, it's the moment of truth. We're gonna try to fire this bad boy up and see how she does. It's alive. Mower's back up and running, purring like a kitten, nice and quiet, good compression, everything's great. I'm thrilled. I hope you got something out of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.